Can you enumerate again all the key benefits of doing or implementing robotics in a business? You spoke in a different conversation. You spoke about fraud detection and revenue leakage and all these good things. So what are the sort of the drivers other than trying to increase productivity on simple processes?
I've stepped into quite a few businesses at the most senior level in order to look at what should be done in that business. So regardless of coming along and saying, you've got guys that are technologists and their specialty is technology and what it can do, it was to sit there and say, if you're going to implement any technology, what is the impact of that technology on your stakeholder environment? In other words, you can imagine a company like South African Airways or a company like Anglo American or a big bank has to manage its stakeholder environments, its shareholders. It needs to manage that incredibly carefully. And a lot of the time, these big institutions, some of the state-owned enterprises don't have any money. And what's more, it's out in the public domain, and it is what it is in terms of that. But the reality is you've got to sit there and say, well, if I'm going to do this, the first thing that comes to any executive's mind is, I want to replace people with robots. And I've got, I might have 30,000 people in a business and I need to sack 10,000 of them in order to make an adjustment to the P&L. And the first thing I always do is when I enter an organization, I say to them, well, is that the best you have? I think anyone can do that. I think if you employed any donut who come into an organization and give that response. So the immediate part would you sit there and say, well, guys, if I look at the entire suite of what you're doing, if I look at experience data, and experience is product experience, brand experience, service experience, employee experience, whatever other experience data that you've got, big and small, on the big on the outside of the organization, the small on the inside of the organization. If I look at that experience data, am I getting good analytics off that data in order to create opportunities within the organization? So it might be upsell opportunities, cross-sell opportunities. It might be a new market stream. It might be whatever it is. It could be feeding the marketing campaigns or whatever it's doing around experience data is somewhere to focus before you focus on staff. The other part of it was to sit there and say, well, if you're in some organizations that are bleeding because of fraud, it would absolutely be a good part to start on the fraud front. If you can look at any state-owned entity that you can speak about today, experience data is probably that size. Fraud is that size, and you might have revenue leakage that's that size too. And the people problem is probably this size. So when you're doing all the well-laid plans of men and women in terms of your strategic roadmap, every single C-suite executive always came before a headcount discussion.
I think that's a hugely important key insight and key principle. Thank you very much for sharing that with us. And that leads us actually into the next theme is around organizational positioning. Because the immediate emotional reaction when you mention robotics is coming back to its original meaning that I mentioned at the outset. We're going to be enslaved or made redundant. Okay, so how do you position a project within an organization, starting at the C-suite level, and how does one communicate and manage the change management process and position this correctly? And the key paradox here is you're asking for people to implement something that might render them jobless or redundant. So those are big questions, and how do you ensure that the organization implements this successfully given those constraints?
So, Ty, in every organization that I go into, it's got a CEO and it's got a triangle below the CEO that tapers down, various levels of executives, moves down right to the guys at the coalface doing the work. And if you look at if you look at the shape of the triangle, it kind of goes, well, everything moves up to that single point. I always say to the CEOs, flip that triangle on its head. you've got to invert the triangle. So the CEO is actually at the bottom of the organization and the people at the coalface are at the top. And that causes, in terms of that, you know, it's a serving culture. So what you really do have is you have the CEO serving his executive team and so forth, and so it goes down. Anywhere where you have it the other way around, you're just going to land up with fear and, you know, generally people coming to work and just being, you know, robots themselves. But the reality is that you want a service culture. So you want to serve those people. Robots are no different. Robots should be seen as a digital employee. They're there to serve the people. So robots in an organization will always report to the people. Please notice I said it will not report to the CIO. It will report to the people. So the people doing the work, that's where the robots serve. And the people will then hence serve their bosses and managers and so forth. And so we go down to the CEO. So that's traditionally how you sit, and that's the way to get success in terms of it. So very often, the first thing I do, and it happens a lot when I go into an organization, the first point of departure is where does this sit in the organization today? And mostly because it's a, you know, it's seen as a technology play, it normally sits within the CIO realm. And the first thing I try to do is get it removed from there. Purely and simply, not because, you know, things might be done, but if you want to execute a project at scale, you need the people to execute that project at scale. It can't be seen as, you know, this is something that IT is handling. It's got to be something that the operational teams are driving, you know, for their burning issues. It might be the customer side, it might be HR with people side, it might be the finance operations guys with recons, it might be whatever it means. That's where it goes. Where I say the CIO becomes involved is on the governance side. So where that stuff sort of touches the technology infrastructure, then I would say absolutely fine in terms of that part. But in terms of driving it across the organization, definitely the people should own it. So pre an organizational design, so sometimes a lot of this stuff is coupled with a fit for purpose restructure. Pre that restructure, it needs to be kind of driven as a CEO project. Post that restructure, it could be considered as chief operations officer.
So yesterday we got a question around, well, how do you align it with data strategy? How do you coordinate all of this with the other technology implementation projects that you've got on the go? It sounds all really complex. So and can you do you always convince the CIO to stay out of it and only have a role as in terms of governance? Well, how do you convince them, really?
Normally in a lot of organizations, it's come down to a point of either one of us leaves the building, purely and simply because I'm not going to get what I need to get if it's going to stay in that environment. If you wanted to stay there, yes, get Ernst & Young by all means to come in, or IBM, and handle a couple of processes for you and make no difference to the P&L. I never subscribe to that, and a lot of the times I go into organizations, the conversation is with the CEO around me coming into that organization to drive a project of critical mass to change the trajectory of the people in that business and make them feel more human. And, you know, it's the first thing I want, Ty, is for the mothers to go home to their children, the fathers to go home to their wives, and their wives to go home to their husbands. It's changing the people in that organization and getting them right on sides, even though they might, in fact, you know, be worried about a Section 189 process or whatever the case may is, or whatever the case is. The reality is you need to drive these projects with heart. If someone knows that you have the best intentions for them and you want to care and grow them, essentially they will be on sides, and they will actually offer up you know, mundane work that they could actually just get rid of and focus and, you know, on the new stuff, and focus on becoming a better contributor in terms of their analytical thinking, in terms of contribution. I don't think anyone wants to come to work and suffer. And I know no one gets up in the morning wanting to come to work and, you know, essentially just stuff things up. They want to come to work, they want to feel engaged, and they want to feel that they're making a contribution And if you can get that in terms of your leadership design correct, very importantly in terms of leadership, how you're going to constantly remind them to be thinking better.
Tell me, so how does the change management and the leadership in these type of projects, how do these aspects differ from other change management projects?
I think that, Ty, as long as, in terms of change management, as long as you're authentic, I use the word authentic. I haven't met one stupid individual in an organization, not one. They can see straight through when a person is self-serving, has a hidden agenda, or some other thing that's at play. If you're an authentic leader in an organization, it will show immediately. The first thing we do as human beings when we meet each other is we size each other up. We're trying to decide, can I trust this person? And if that, and essentially in an organization, if you don't drive through the organization with that passion and say, guys, I am here to do what's good for you. And yes, it might mean that you leave this organization, but guess what? There might be a plan, not a might. You actually have to have a plan for these people when they leave this organization. I look at it this way, I have a son and a daughter. I want the best for them. I often tell them, I can tell them anything, and they know that I can tell them anything because they know that I want the best for them. I'm not sitting there with some hidden agenda to try and do, it's the same story. You're being authentic, and more importantly than not, Ty, is constantly reminding. If any person is left not being reminded on how to behave or how to think, you have an issue. We're only human beings. We all have negative thoughts coming into our minds. We're faced with all sorts of external stimulus during the day. It affects our mind. It affects the way we think. And because of that, we start behaving badly. Essentially, you have to be constantly reminded how to behave. And that's true leadership. There needs to be a mechanism for that in the business, even in terms of a central.
Good, Paul. Thanks for that pointer. They are embarking on a digitization process, and they are following those principles of leadership. But some people are, and we're actually going to have a session, I think next week or the week after, on mental agility. Some people are able to embrace that change. They are naturally mentally curious, and some aren't. So what do you suggest in terms of training, or what have you observed in your projects in terms of training to keep the organization and the thinking, the thinking in synchronization with your robotics process?
Okay, so the biggest thing for robotics and AI, I have lots of guys that come and say, we'll set up a center of excellence. There's a digital center of excellence. And when people talk about that, they talk about exception reporting, beautiful dashboards, all sorts of things, which to me is pretty standard. The thing that's not standard in a center of excellence is the leadership component in terms of a structured project where you actually go through the organization. And part of that is making sure right down, when you're looking right down at the coalface, up to sort of intermediate management, to senior management, to top management, you are reminding there's a mechanism in place where they have to attend workshops on how to think and behave better. It's just there. So the robotics piece or the technology piece is absolutely intertwined with that leadership reminding piece. And even with the most stubborn individuals, I've noticed, I've gone into organizations where you have the most, people that are just really down in the dumps. They are tired. They don't want to be there anymore. They've had enough. They've been sold enough stories. They've seen about, 6 to 7 changes of the Exco. They see a new one walk in the door and they go, oh, here we go, number 9. The reality of that is that if they don't see it by workshopping constantly with these people, and it's not something that happens once a month, it's happening weekly, and there's mechanisms to do it. but they've got to see the authenticity in that center of excellence come through, and there's got to be a plan that shows exactly where these people will be attending these various sessions.